Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Money Macro Talks. I'm here with development economist Dennis Egger, who is an associate professor at the University of Oxford, and he recently published, in my opinion, a super interesting study. I could even say one of the most interesting papers I've read this year, called General Equilibrium Effects of Cash Transfers, Experimental Evidence from Kenya, which is very economist talk for... basically describing a massive macroeconomic size experiment of basic income in Kenya. Like what essentially how I interpreted it was like, hey, what happens if you just insert a massive amount of cash into a local economy? Like what happens then? Dennis, is that a roughly a correct description?
Yeah, exactly. Thanks, Joeri, for that summary and also for having me. Yeah, exactly. So that's the basic idea. We sort of trace out the impacts of these unconditional cash transfers on recipients, people who receive the cash, but then also on sort of their neighbors, local villages, local prices. The sort of economy as a whole in this rural part of Kenya. And this is what we mean by general equilibrium, is sort of not just recipients' impacts, but sort of economy-wide impacts of cash. And just to sort of start, what was this experiment, or what was the treatment, so to speak? So these were unconditional cash transfers given by the NGO Give Directly. And their approach is sort of we've done a lot of different development interventions in all kinds of ways, shapes, or forms. But what we're going to do is just give unconditional cash. Their view is like, people know best what they need, and if you let them choose, whether they need to invest in their kids' education, or whether they want to expand their business or improve their home, or maybe improve their nutrition, that's up to them. And so we just give cash unconditionally, no strings attached. And that's what they did. And the transfers were pretty large. So this is $1,000 per household, which in this part of the world is about 80% of annual household income. So think about this cash as sort of 1 year worth of income. And that's already sort of gives you a sense. It's not going to be completely changing your life, but it's a substantial chunk of money. And you can do a lot of different things with it, and people do. What do they do? As I sort of was outlining, they did very different things depending on what they needed, right? We do see some increases in educational expenditure. We see some investments in businesses. We see a lot more consumption, improvements in food, improvements in sort of housing conditions. People build a new roof and so on, as you would expect. And there we sort of follow in a long tradition of studies that have shown that if people cash, they benefit and they spend it generally wisely. In particular, we don't really see any of these sort of negative potential impacts that people are worried about, that people would gamble with that money or spend it in unwise ways. We don't see that at all. But then our study sort of goes beyond and sort of asks, what happens to their neighbors? What happens to the economy? And that's sort of really a novel part here. And the idea is that by spending that money, I'm creating demand in this local economy for products that are produced there. And so what we show is that actually, correspondingly with this increase in spending by recipients, local revenue for firms goes up by roughly the same amount. And that increases local wages as well as profits for local business owners. And when we talk about local business owners, these are typically one-person firms, a barber shop or, a street vendor sitting on the street, selling food or things like that. So their wages and profits go up, and therefore their incomes go up. And they can spend it again on goods and services by other people in the economy. And what this sort of leads to is this sort of cycle, this loop of spending, and what we call a multiplier effect, that every dollar can be spent not only once, but it's sort of coming in as income for somebody else. They spend it, that creates income for somebody else. And overall, we sort of find that every dollar that Give Directly injected in this economy created $2.50 worth of local spending or economic activity. Now, one thing that you might have been worried about is that if you inject a lot of cash, and I said it's 1 year worth of income for recipients, But for the economy as a whole, because not everybody get it, it's still 15 to 20% of local GDP that was sort of transferred in terms of cash. So this is a massive shock for the local economy, not just for households that are receiving it. What you might have been worried is that this creates inflation, right? So if you just print money in economics 101, this is what people worry about. And so we collected lots of prices across these villages and markets, and we don't actually find very much. So inflation here is below 1%, and very, very small. And so this suggests that all of these gains, this multiplier that I was telling you about, is in real terms, so adjusted for prices, 2.5. And so it's not sort of just the fact that the goods got more expensive, it's really people were able to buy more things, and therefore be better off more generally in this economy. And so that's sort of the main finding, and then this leaves us with a puzzle of how is the multiplier so big? Why didn't prices rise? And I hope we can talk about that as well.
Absolutely, yeah. So if you give a lot of cash to a rural Kenyan economy, people benefit more from it than you actually give them, and it doesn't create inflation. Is sort of the super short summary of what you just told me.
And this is super important for these types of programs, right? It sort of suggests that, the benefit of cash transfers are much bigger than you would think if you just looked at the recipients. So often when we think about, how can I give charitably, or what can a government do, we think only about how that impacts people that are directly benefiting from these types of programs. Well, what we show is that you're underestimating it by, 60%, because, you get 2.5 times as much out of it as you put in. And so that's a really, really quantitatively important point to make.
So that's really like, if you go back to maybe, the economics that someone had in high school, the idea that, okay, I get $1, I spend it with my neighbor, my neighbor then spends part of it again, at least, not everything typically, and then in the end you end up with the estimate is then like 2.5 times the overall income for everybody increases, as a consequence of you giving only a few people this cash. So how does this then? Why does this then stop at 2.5? Like how does that work?
Yeah. So, I mean, the way to think about it, again, going back to your very, very first sort of Keynesian economic model, is that not 100% of every dollar ends up back in the local economy. So what turns out to be really important is this, what we call marginal propensity to spend locally. So what fraction of every dollar spent ends up back in that local economy? So in our setting, people typically walk to their closest market, which is sort of 30 minutes walk away. And so everybody purchases things locally. So that's one point. So first of all the spending is local. The second thing that's important here is nobody saves in financial assets. So in sort of maybe in richer countries, you could keep some of it in the bank and you're not going to spend all of it. And so your marginal propensity to consume out of getting $1 might be not 100% here. The way people save is by, for example, purchasing livestock or purchasing durables, improving their homes. That's the predominant form of saving. But that's still produced by something else. Somebody has to raise that cow. Somebody has to sell you the corrugated iron sheet that you need to improve your roof. And so even when people are saving, they're saving in a way such that the money that they're spending is ending up in somebody else's pockets or somebody else's income. And so because of that, it's basically 100% ends up as local spending. But some of it, of course, still leaves this local economy because some of the intermediates are imported. Right, so if I buy pots and pans, this region doesn't produce any pots and pans. They're all imported, typically from Mombasa Port and China. Same with mattresses and mobile phones, and of course, and other types of things. The predominant form of production locally is agriculture. Almost everybody has a household farm, and then also some local services, like as I said, food vendors and bookstores and barbers and all of that. But they don't really produce these durables, and so part of that spending ends up sort of leaving the economy. And that's why at some point it stops. Mm-hmm. So that's the sort of simple, what we would call the nominal cycle. This is just accounting for every dollar and counting it again and counting it again and counting it again. But what matters for people's well-being, as I sort of was already outlining before, is whether that accounting is in real terms, sort of in actual, bread and butter and iron sheets and so on, or whether it's just increases in prices. So really, the key here for to look at welfare and people's well-being is the point that prices didn't rise, and so somehow this economy was able to also produce more actual services and products in response to this increase in demand. And that's really the key here. If supply was fixed, if the economy was not able to produce more, all that would happen is prices go up. Here it turns out that, well, actually locally, the economy, these small shops and so on, were able to produce a lot more in response to facing higher demand, and that's really the key to the result.
So we've really essentially already talked about like two sort of cornerstones of economic theory. One is the Keynesian multiplier, so the idea that money keeps circulating in the economy. And then the second one is, do you think about it in a sort of quantity of money kind of framework that if you increase the supply of money in an economy, but that economy doesn't produce more, then of course you'll get inflation. But if that economy produces more, then you don't have to see any inflation at all. Is that how you think about it?
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know for those viewers or listeners who have had some sort of economics before. You have your supply and demand curve, and if your supply curve is fixed and your demand shifts, your price will go up, right? But if both your supply and demand curve shift, or if your supply curve is very flat, meaning that in response to demand, supply increases a lot, then you get a lot of output increase and very, very little price increase. So that's the sort of simple theory behind it. And so the question here is, how was supply so elastic? Like, how was it possible for these local businesses to create additional supply? And I can talk a little bit about what we're thinking here. So one thing that could happen is that people just work more. This is what we sort of call the labor supply response. And this is actually a really interesting topic when it comes to cash transfers. So in rich countries, people are often worried, well, if we did universal basic income and we gave people cash, they would stop working and they would actually reduce supply, right? But typically what you find in developing country settings is that people don't work any less, and sometimes they even work more when you give them money. And this is sort of this idea that maybe there's other constraints preventing them from working. Maybe what they need is a little bit of money to start up a business and to be able to work more, or maybe they need a little bit of money to be able to travel to the market and work for somebody else there. So in our setting, we find basically no change in labor supply and a slight change of work. People work a bit less hours on their farm, and they work more on outside in sort of non-agricultural service and local businesses. But certainly that cannot explain the big increase in supply. It's not true that there's just lots of other people working longer hours. The other thing is these intermediate inputs, like I said. Maybe this economy is just, the whole increase is coming from importing more stuff. And that's clearly part of the story. I said it's about 30% of the story is increased imports, and that's great because it does mean people have access to all these durables that they didn't before, and that's good for them. But again, it's only a small part of the story.
When you say durables, you mean stuff like sheep or better houses or pots, or like that? These are intermediate goods too. Yeah,
exactly. With sheep and cows, some of them might be imported, some of them might be locally produced, but with other things like pots and pans and mattresses and iron roofs and things like that, those are predominantly imported. So that's part of the story, but it's still, when we do the quantification, it's only a small part of the story. And so what's left? You might have thought maybe people use this money, invest it to increase their productivity, right? Or to sort of start new businesses, to increase the inventory of their businesses. And we don't really see, surprisingly, very much of that. And one really telling fact from the study is that firms which were owned by people who received money and firms that were owned by people who did not receive money expanded exactly by the same amount. Their revenues went up by the same amount. And so what we're taking out of this is, if it was something about me having money, investing that money, and growing my business through that, then you would have seen businesses of people who received cash to growing more than other businesses. But we don't really see that. We see everybody growing by the same amount. And so really, the effect here is driven by the overall aggregate increase in demand. More money, more people buying more things, the money starting to circulate. And a striking fact here, and I didn't mention this before, is that when we measure people's expenditure a year and a half after these cash transfers went out, the average increase in spending for people who received money and those who did not is exactly the same. So after a year and a half, this sort of tide that lifts all boats, the circulation of money has sort of gone around so many times that it's sort of really indistinguishable whether you initially got it or not. And this is also true for these businesses. Okay, so it's not increases in labor, it's not increases in investment. What is it?
Well, I was wondering, when you said like after 1.5 years, the tide has risen all boats. So did the economy then expand a little bit, like even after 1.5 years?
Yeah, exactly. So this is important, right? So when I say the 2.5 multiplier, that's sort of cumulatively over about the first 2 years after the transfers. Now, it could be much larger even in the future. And now we're sort of back in the field collecting more data 5, 7, and 10 years after the cash to see if these effects persisted. So everything we're talking about here is sort of in the short to medium run, and any longer term effects could be even bigger, right? So this is up to 2.5 years. But yes, so even 2.5 years later, the economy was bigger, people were spending more, revenues were higher in these businesses. Okay, so just to sort of come back, so people worked more in non-agriculture than in agriculture, but they didn't work longer hours overall. There's some increase in imports. There's not all that much in investment. So what's the missing piece? And sort of what we come down, and we just have a new paper out on that as well, is that it has something to do with idle capacity or sort of underutilization of the existing amount of labor and capital that was already there. And so the story is something like this. 90% of firms in this setting are one-person firms, like I already said. Think about the barber shop. Think about somebody sitting on the side of the road fixing motorbikes or washing motorbikes. Think about a small food seller, a retail store, things like that, are one-person firms. And you see this not just in rural Kenya, you see this in all developing countries as a very prevalent phenomenon, including in sort of urban markets. And the idea here is that even though you're sitting there trying to sell your things for 8 hours a day, maybe you're just actually selling things 4 hours a day or 3 hours a day. And now you have twice as many customers, you're a bit more busy, but you're not going to work any longer hours when we ask you how many hours did you work. And so what this means in economics terms is it's like an increase in productivity, right? For the same amount of hours, you can sell twice as much. So that's a doubling of labor productivity. And so what we sort of conjecture in this initial paper and now sort of confirm and model in a sort of quantitative model with this new paper is that a lot of this big multiplier has to do with slack or underutilization or idle capacity of workers and machines. So I'll give you a machine example as well. The predominant form of manufacturing here is grain milling or agricultural processing, right? So people predominantly produce maize here, and then they grind that maize into maize flour every week for their weekly use. And every village has a mill, and people go to the mill in the village because it's sort of too expensive in these small quantities to go to the next village or travel very far. And then the flour is less storable than the maize itself, and so you have to do it every week. But that mill may run 2 hours a day, 3 hours a day. And now people have a bit more money, they have a bit more maize to grind, but maybe now it runs 4 hours a day. But you don't need to buy a new machine. And so we sort of think that's why we don't really see that much on additional hiring or additional investment, is that the existing capacity was just not fully utilized. And when you then stimulate demand, that makes it really easy for firms to respond and supply more because they were not fully at capacity before.
So that is also a staple of Keynesian economics, right? Like very often, if maybe in the rich world, they talk about the lost decades or something in Europe. And then very often they have these Keynesian economists saying, well, it's because there's not enough demand, and that's the effect that you are seeing in a developing developing economy then.
Yeah,
essentially,
yeah, exactly.
Right?
So, yeah, the idea of slack is not new, right? So it's exactly what you're saying. It's this Keynesian story that in times of depression, or when prices don't adjust downwards like they should, you have a lot of unemployment, and so you have a lot of slack in the economy. And when you then stimulate demand, you can bring these unemployed workers and the unemployed machines and so on into the production process, and prices won't actually rise in this setting, because you're not actually hitting any capacity constraint or price pressure, because you have this reservoir of unemployed or underused capacity to bring in. What's really new about the way we model it, and not that new, it goes, I mean, Arthur Lewis, very eminent economist, was theorizing about this in the 40s, but what he didn't have is an experiment and actual data on the ground and so on to test this, is that in the Keynesian story, this is all cyclical stuff. So the Keynesian story is like prices don't fall in a recession quick enough, and so you have more, the way this adjusts is you have to have more unemployment, and so on, and that's why you have slack temporarily, and then at some point you go back to equilibrium or steady state, and then maybe the economy is overheating, and at that point you certainly shouldn't inject more money. So this is what central banks do, right? They sort of try to ride the business cycle. It's a sort of cyclical phenomenon, and it's very topical right now with the recent sort of discussion around inflation, whether it was the COVID policies that fueled it, and now it's come down actually with very little increase in unemployment, which is extremely successful and different from previous episodes. So well done to some of the central banks here, but this is all about cyclical stuff. Our economy in Kenya at the time of the experiment was growing at a steady rate. There was no recession. It wasn't really something about that particular time period that made the multiplier big. It's something more structural about the types of economies in developing countries that mean that there's underutilization in steady state, or always, like even when the economy is going normally, there is more underutilized labor and capital in these economies. And there's different theories. I mean, our theory, right, is this idea of very many small firms. So indivisible inputs. You would want to hire 0.6 workers, but you have to hire at least one, because demand would only, utilize your worker for 0.6 or 60% of the day, but you need to have at least one person there. Now, of course, if most of your firms are 50, 60 employees, going from 60 to 61 is much less consequential than 0 to 1. And if all firms are either between 0, 1, 2, 3 workers, that's a much more binding constraint. And so that's the story that we put forward. But there might be others, right? There's sort of lean seasons in the agricultural cycle where there's a lot of sort of idle labor that isn't being employed. There might be things like fluctuations or uncertainty in demand, like you just don't know how many people are going to come to the market today. Maybe that varies over the agricultural season, and so maybe you set up your business slightly bigger to be able to serve demand at the peak time, but then over the not so peak time, you're not fully at capacity, and so the more difficult it is to plan, the more slack there is. So there's different factors that are present in developing countries that suggest that slack might be permanently or higher. And with this sort of new paper that we're basically showing this in cross-country data, we're showing that slack is higher in small firms, which are much more prevalent in developing countries. It is higher in remote markets when it's hard for firms to access their consumers because transportation costs are high. Everybody walks to the market. These are rural economies, so demand is low. And so you find more slack in these remote markets, and you find more slack in these sort of integer constrained or sort of you find more slack in sectors where you have these discrete choices between 0 workers and 1 worker, 0 machine
small
and
firms.
one machine. Exactly. And so that's the difference here between the Keynesian, which is a more of a cyclical story, and our story, which says, well, maybe these multipliers are big in developing country settings always. And what's sort of nice is after this study that we're talking about here, other studies have come out in places like Brazil and Mexico looking at multipliers. And they also find significantly larger multipliers in these types of developing country settings than you would find in, say, the US or European countries. And so there does seem to be something about multipliers just being bigger because of underutilization in developing countries more broadly.
So does that imply that, going back to sort of basic income, because this was a basic income experiment, right? Does it imply that if you do a basic income sort of cash drop in a very much a developing economy like Kenya, the benefit will be bigger than if you do it in a developed economy like, I don't know, Switzerland or something like that? Because, and then in technical terms, you could say because the multiplier is higher, meaning that money will circulate more and it won't cause inflation because there's so much slack in the economy. Because if you follow your theory, there's so many one-person firms.
Yes. Yeah, that's exactly it, right? So I think, like macroeconomic policymakers think about this all the time. Like, when should we do stimulus and where should we do stimulus? The when is this sort of Keynesian idea. We should increase government spending when there's slack in the economy cyclically, when there's a depression or a recession. Where should we do it? Well, first of all, we should obviously think about who needs it, right? So we want to target it based on poverty and people that are badly hit or deserving from other reasons. But we should also think about the macroeconomy. Like, where should we do it? Well, where multipliers are big, where we think people are going to spend it, and they're going to spend it on locally produced goods so that other people can benefit from that, and then they will spend it again. And as you're rightly saying, that also means we should spend it in areas where we expect there to be more slack or more elastic supply. And it just turns out, developing countries, rural places, remote places with many small firms tend to be these types of places, and that's where you would see bigger impacts from these demand stimulus policies. I think sort of more at an even higher level is it just puts demand back into the sort of debates around development policy. Like, how do you get these places to grow? You could either try to increase productivity and give all these businesses business training, and the World Bank and governments do this a lot. They're like, oh, we need to improve our businesses. But if they're already not using their capacity fully, you can increase their capacity as much as you want. It's not going to raise output because they already weren't using the little capacity they had. So there, it just suggests that demand is a really important constraint to think about. And as development policymakers, we should think about what can we do to improve that. And that's not just, government purchases and cash transfers. It could also be improving firms' access to demand, to exporting, improving infrastructure so that markets can integrate and you can access more consumers, developing online marketplaces, like, for example, Alibaba in China is a big part of why rural development took off, because firms could now start selling in bigger markets. So it just sort of brings demand back on the center of sort of how do we create development.
Can I use like a super a super controversial maybe stereotype about development economics to maybe illustrate this further? Let me know if I'm going too far, but like, there's a stereotype thing that people say, right? I don't want to give a man fish, I want to teach him how to fish. But could you then say, no, that you should give the man's neighbors money so that there's actually purchasing power for people to buy the fish from that man? Or am I taking it too far?
No. I like that a lot. There's a lot of this view of like, cash are just handouts. They're going to make people lazy. They're going to not want to invest in their skills. So really, if you want to create long-term development, you need to increase productivity, like teach people to fish in education. And I'm not saying you shouldn't do that. I think it's certainly true that a big part of the development process is improvements in education and human capital and productivity. And you're not going to, just by reducing slack, get the average Kenyan income to the US income. There's vast differences in productivity that are not due to slack. But I think you're right that locally you can get a lot of bang for your buck for increasing demand, and demand is at least part of that story, and it's sometimes been a little bit forgotten. And I think what our work sort of shows is that it is a key determinant of output. It does matter in developing country settings, and we should think about it too. right? Not either or, but I think we should definitely do both. It's this idea of if you shift both supply and demand curves, that's how you get output to rise by the most.
Yeah, and you do that already automatically, right? You do that like, okay, you can target supply, just target supply, but also you're finding that just by increasing demand, you automatically also increase supply, right?
Yeah, you crowd in supply, exactly. And that at some point will stop, right? At some point, everybody's fully utilized, right? This is sort of our new paper shows that, the multiplier is big, but at some point it runs out. You can't do this forever. You can't print $1 trillion and drop it, on the Kenyan economy because, at some point, all these firms will be fully utilized. There's no more slack left, no more unemployed left to crowd in. And then the only way to increase output is by productivity gains. But, it runs for quite some time where you can get large multipliers. I think the other point I wanted to pick up on is this, like, teach a man how to fish. Is like maybe they don't want to fish. I think that's a really important bit about unconditional cash transfers. Give them a goat. Maybe they don't want to go. Teach them how to fish. Maybe they don't want to fish. Maybe they want to have a goat instead. And the nice thing about the sort of unconditional part of the cash is that the money goes directly to people, and they decide with the local market, whom they presumably know best, much better than the NGO from far away who thinks they understand what's going on. They presumably know best where to get the best inputs for their business, which businesses might be the most viable. And I think it's just a sort of non-paternalistic way of thinking about this. Like, people are poor, they're not stupid. They know, like, you give them money and they use it sensibly because they know their context very, very well. And so that's the other part of this of this part that of this type of intervention that I really like, is that it lets people decide and puts this sort of dignity or the decision power in recipients' hands.
So that actually reminds me a lot, like, because I've been linking some of what you've said to Keynes, which is very much a center left or something economist, right? But actually, what you're saying to me now really reminds me of Hayek, who sort of has very much this position that the information is localized, and that's very much sort of what you're saying here, right? I would actually not say, like, it's not about them not wanting a fish. It's that they know that getting a fish is not optimal for the economy, right? Like, it's not necessarily just about wanting. It's just that they have the better information than the person who's giving out at the top this aid, right? So it's could you say that's very much in line then with Hayek's theory of sort of dispersed information?
Yeah, I think it's both, right? So one is the information thing. And I believe that's very, very important, right? Like, when you look at many of NGOs, who many of them do great work and have great intentions, but they have to procure things in a different way. They have to have all these sort of mid-level consultants and nationwide distribution things, and there's a lot of money wasted in that. And just locally, people have much better information on where the good things and where the business opportunities are. So that's the point you're making. Yeah. The other point about the wants is about the preferences, right? Is like, why should a donor or a government and with the government it's a bit more justified as long as it has some sort of democratic legitimacy, but why should, like, a foreign NGO decide what you need is a church, or what you need is a water point, or what you need is a goat because you should be growing goats? I just think that's a slightly paternalistic way of thinking about it, and we really want to give people who are supposed to want to help some input or decision power over how they want to use the resources that we're giving them. And so this unconditional cash is just both efficient because it uses local information, and it gets over the overheads and all the intermediates and the consultants, but it's also in a sense fair, and it puts the decision power into recipients.
No, I see how that's a different argument, and they can both be true. Yeah, fair, exactly. Totally fair. Yeah. Hey, and one thing that I really liked about your study compared to sort of work that has been done earlier, because we've talked a lot about theories now, right? Like the multiplier theory, a little bit of quantity theory of money, or at least sort of supply and demand, like leading to inflation or not, with slack. But essentially, and it's fun to talk about theory, but essentially your work is very empirical, and that's what makes it really stand out. It's very scientific, because I can get into all sorts of arguments, as economists have done for hundreds of years, and we can solve it. But you have actually done taken a very scientific approach. Can you tell us maybe a little bit more about that? Like, how do you do a massive experiment? Like, how do you set that up, and how does that give validity to some of the theories that you just mentioned?
Yeah. No, thanks for going there. And I think it harkens back to this early discussion that we had around randomized controlled trials, and how do they feature in economics. So let's start there. What is a randomized controlled trial? So it's sort of started in medicine, and the idea is you randomly give some people the drug that you want to test, and then the other people randomly get a placebo. And then you check these people over time, and you see how they're doing. And then you see, if you find any difference between those people who got the drug and those people who got the placebo, because it was randomly assigned, that difference has to be the effect of the drug. Right? Mm-hmm. Why? Because this treatment is random. Like, everybody's equally likely to end up in this group or that group, and there's no average differences in sort of, let's say, gender and age and all the underlying factors that might impact whether you get better. All of those things are on average the same between the treated and the control group. And so you get a really good causal treatment effect from these RCT type studies. Now, compare that with another setting where you just said, I'm going to stand in the center of town and I'm going to say anybody who wants can take this medicine, and then they take it, and then you compare whether they get better to people who didn't take it. That's much different, because the people who decide to approach you, take the medicine, they might be on average different. They might have recovered anyway. They might have been much sicker, because that's why they even came there and sought out your treatment, right? And so then you cannot say the difference is because of the treatment. Maybe it's because of all these underlying differences and factors.
Yeah, because the sick people, you can actually find the medicine doesn't work very well, because they're still sicker at the end. But
yeah,
okay.
Or they would have been sicker anyway, regardless of the medicine, right? And so this is sort of why experiments are being used in the sciences. And then in the 90s, this started to come into social sciences and economics. The idea is, why don't we do this for economic policies, for malaria nets distributed to villagers, for scholarships given to students, just randomly assigned, and then see, do they improve their test scores, these kind of things. And that's really been a big revolution. And in 2019, Michael Kremer, Abhijit Banerjee, and Esther Duflo got sort of the Nobel Prize for this movement. But it wasn't just the three of them, right? It was a sort of vast change in the way we do empirical economics, and it started in development and has now sort of reached lots of other parts. And often we call this the credibility revolution in economics. It's sort of, basically taking our empirics seriously, not just putting theories out there, but disciplining them with experiments in the real world. And that's sort of been a big push over the last 30 years. This is what we did here, but we sort of went a little bit beyond. And before I tell you what we did, I wanted to get into this history, because one downside of these experiments is that often you have to do them in a very specific context, right? You have to find a school that is willing to randomize scholarships. You have to find a hospital system where they're willing to sort of randomize across different villages certain interventions. And so that often means that these are localized. They're also really expensive to run. You have to go collect data, you have to do the intervention, you have to be really careful that only the treated and not the control gets it, and you have to collect lots of information. And so again, that limits their size. And so people have been getting a bit frustrated. So you're only testing things that you can randomize, not the big things that you may be out of the scope of even possibility to randomize. And you're only answering these small questions in small parts of the world, which we are not sure generalize to other parts of the world, right? And so, our study is sort of, I guess, a counterexample to that. Like we set out to study a big question, like, is Keynesian macroeconomics right? What is the macroeconomic multiplier? But using these tools from microeconomics, from experiments. And that's what got me excited about it in the first place. So how do you do that? Well, you experiment on a large enough scale, right? Rather than sort of taking 100 people and randomly giving money to 50 versus another, now we're sort of randomizing at the village level. We had 700 villages. Some villages get money, all of them. All of the eligible people in a treated village get money, and in the control village, they don't. And what we did on top of that is we had a second layer of randomization. So in some regions, 2/3 of villages were randomly chosen to receive money. In other regions, only 1/3 of villages was treated. And what this creates is really sort of market level or local economy level differences in the intensity of treatment or in the amount of cash that was flowing into this region versus this region. And so the answer to how do you do macroeconomics with experiments? Well, you do bigger experiments. Your unit of randomization is not the individual, but the village or the region or the group of villages or the market catchment area. And this is basically what we did.
And the region was fairly remote, right? So it was also not super connected to the global economy, if I remember from your paper.
Well, yes and no. It's basically Siaya County in Western Kenya. It's on a main road between Mombasa Port and Kampala. So it's fairly integrated with sort of trade links. But it's local in the sense of what I told you before, is that the way people shop is they walk to the weekly market. And so 85% or 80% plus of all of people's spending is within 4 kilometers of their home. And this is, basically within 1 hour walking. Something like 50-60% is within 2 kilometers, within half an hour. So most people shop very locally. And what this sort of allows, why does this help us? It does mean that giving money here and here is actually going to create very different demand effects or in that market versus that market. If everybody shopped everywhere, that wouldn't work. But because people shop relatively locally, it works in our setting. So I want to say one thing that sort of it comes up quite a bit, and that's like, is this ethical? Like, why are you running these experiments? What do the people who are in the control group think? And so this is obviously something we take very seriously, and it's an extremely important debate in this way of doing research. But it's also true that with every government program or with every NGO program, there's people who get it and people who don't get it. So it's not like because we're randomizing, we're creating these control groups. Like, the typical example is like we would like to reach many, many more people. There's many, many more deserving and eligible and needing people, but we just don't have the resources to give it to everyone or to give it to everyone already all at once. But we still want to understand, does it work? How could it work better? And so in these types of settings, randomization is often a fair way and a useful way to do this, right? We have an oversubscribed list of people who might be eligible, but we can't treat all of them. So let's do it fair. Let's do a lottery and also try to out of that get as much learning as we can to improve the program as it then rolls out.
But I can imagine that in contrast to you choosing a village and everyone getting the money, but now you only give it to certain people in the village. Doesn't it then create a lot of jealousy? Like, because my neighbor got it, but I didn't. It's still a different social effect than, oh, the village, way over got it, and our village didn't get it.
Yeah, this is a super interesting and important point, and we call these potentially negative psychological spillovers. So the fact that basically the core point from what I've said before is that even if I did not get the money, I'm better off. And I'm substantially better off because my neighbors got the money and I experience all these positive economic benefits. Because, maybe I had a barbershop and my neighbor got money and now they're coming to get their hair cut more, and that's good for me. So, economically I'm better off, but I might still be sort of psychologically thinking, I'm better off, but, I didn't get the money and I get jealous or I compare myself or inequality goes up. And that was an open question. And as an empiricist, I'm like, well, we should test that. We should try to measure it at least. And so we understand whether that concern is valid. So in our setting, and again, there was no randomization within Village here, and Give directly, for the reasons you outline, doesn't do this because they don't want to create very, very stark differences between one neighbor and another. So they'll always choose the Village as the unit of randomization. But in our setting, we asked these kind of things. How satisfied are you with your life? We collected measures of depression and anxiety and life satisfaction and lots of other sort of psychological well-being measures. And we don't find in our setting any negative impacts. If anything, those go up in line with income, or they stay the same or insignificantly different from zero. So that concern, at least empirically, didn't play out. But it is something you want to think about very carefully when you design these experiments, like how close are your control and treatment groups, not just because of the spillovers that you then have to worry about, because if they're right next to each other, your control group's always sort of, in a sense, contaminated and also treated, but also because of the ethics and the fairness of it.
Okay, yeah. So you did give entire village, everyone in it, money, but the villages were randomized, and then the second layer was that in some regions 1/3 of villages got it, and in other regions 2/3. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
So now you can compare entire regions which got randomly more or less money, and again, these regions would otherwise have looked the same because the assignment of that was random, was by lottery. So that's what you need, right? So you need the randomization, then you need a lot of data, right? Then you need to actually trace out from before the cash, during and after, what happens. And so what did we do? So we collected a lot of household surveys, about 10,000 households, and these surveys are representative of the entire population, and they're sort of very long. They're sort of 2.5 hours, 3 hours, and we asked them about absolutely everything. Your consumption, your economic activities, your as I said, all of these psychological well-being measures, child health and schooling, all the kind of things that you might want to know, where they shop, what they buy, and these kind of things. We also collected data on a representative set of firms. So we have about 5,000 surveys with local enterprises. And to do that, you have to do a census first. So you go village to village, market to market. You capture a census of all the sellers and enterprises that are there. And then you randomly sample some of them. And then again, you ask them about their profits, their revenues, their business models, where their employees, all of these things. We also collected price data, because this was key, right? You want to understand what happens to inflation. And so we went to all weekly markets in the entire region. The entire region has about 400,000 people living there, and about 61 markets, which happen at least weekly, sometimes daily, sometimes twice a week. So we went there every month and we collected price quotes, 3 price quotes for about 100 products. And so overall, it's like over 400,000 individual prices every month for 30 months, allowing us to really in detail track the price impacts in high intensely treated areas versus not on all these different products. So it was a substantive data collection effort. And like I said, this was only up to 2 years. Now we're back 5-7 years later, 10 years to try to see the long-term impacts of that.
And this is really analog work. Is it really just you and your colleagues going to that market physically every time and going to a different sort of market stand, like, hey, can you give me a quote for grain? Hey, can you give me a quote for fish? Does it work like that? Is that how it works?
Certainly not me. The reason being that I'm not from there. I don't understand the local context, and I also look very different from people there. So people probably wouldn't tell me the truth, or they wouldn't give me a fair price and things like that. We all know that, right? So it certainly wouldn't be me. But we work with very amazing local teams and surveyors. At any point in time, we had something like 60 to 80 people who were working for us doing these surveys. And, they're typically sort of graduates, university graduates from Kenya who are excited about research, who love doing this, have a lot of experience doing this. And it's not, this is a hard science, like asking questions the right way so that you get building rapport so that people trust you, doing it in a sensitive way so that you're not annoying people or that you're not getting them to leave the study. This is very sensitive and very important. And so that the whole field operation is a big part of the work, and all our local collaborators are incredibly good at that, and a big part of why this study came out so well. It's not analog, right? It's not like you don't write on paper. There's these sort of data collection softwares that work on phones and tablets, and so you go through that, and then we get the data.
No, but they input it by hand, right? In that.
Yeah, they do. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, they actually go and talk to people. Yeah.
Because these days, in sort of developed economies, you can just sort of access digital data from the cash register, right? It's not the cash register, it's the payment system. Yeah. But it's not like that.
No, that's right. So, basically what we had to do is we had to become our own National Office of Statistics. Right? We had to come up with GDP measures, but from our own survey data. Because basically there just isn't enough high spatial resolution data for that particular area in administrative data in Kenya. There isn't, firms don't file Social Security because the whole economy is informal, so you can't use sort of Social Security registries. The economy is largely non-digital. It's cash-based. It's informal. So basically, the only way to really capture this is through these surveys. There's increasingly, and this is also cool that this work has collaborated with lots of other people. Sort of remote sensing type approaches to this. So there's a work by Huang et al. Who basically try to see if you can detect changes in people's wealth from space. So, their roof material might change, the reflectivity, how much greenness you have, how much plants. So all of these things, and then you train a sort of, you train a machine learning algorithm to detect if you have some ground truth to predict sort of wealth and income from those sort of satellite markers. And they actually applied this to our experiment, and they showed that, you can see changes from space. Obviously not everything, but you can see changes in roof reflectivity, you can see changes in agricultural patterns. And so that's sort of an exciting new way to bring in other types of data, but of course it's always just going to complement the survey work that we do.
Oh, but that's a different research project, but it is sort of a validity check of your work. Like also from satellite data, they saw that your survey data is likely correct or reliable.
Yeah, I mean, the question there then is like, well, if 10% of houses have a metal roof now instead of a thatched roof, which is a thing you can see from space, what does that really mean for welfare? That's the translation of that is much harder. Whereas in the survey, of course, you do see people's consumption, which is a good measure of welfare, but also their psychological well-being and so on. So that's the limitation. But I just want to say, it's really cool that this project keeps growing, both in terms of studying long-term impacts, but also crowding in work by others and who want to work with our data, on our data in a different way. And it's just been wonderful to collaborate.
So then, okay, so you're collecting all of this data from these randomized places, both the treated and the non-treated. The main collection method was surveys. And people going to the market and doing like inputs, which is sort of a survey. And you track, you mentioned you made your own measure of GDP. So that is sort of income. You track the income that people have. How did you track the assets that people have? Is this also like with the survey, very extensive? Like how many goats do you have? And then how many goats do you have now? Does it work like that?
Same thing, yeah. So we measure GDP in two different ways, right? One is what you said is income. So all sources of income in the economy. So we ask people about wages, about transfers, about government receipts, about like social program receipts, about profits in their businesses, about rental payments for the capital that they might loan out to others. So that's the total income of the economy. We compute that from our surveys. The other way of getting at GDP is just like economic activity, right? So you can do it from the income side or the expenditure side. So we also have the expenditure side is expenditure on durables and things like that, but also it's going to include assets and government expenditure, and taxes. And so, the nice thing, and this was really reassuring for us, is that whether we do it this way or this way, from completely different survey questions with completely different methodologies, we get one gives us a multiplier of 2.3, the other one of 2.5 or something like that. I forget the exact numbers, but it gives us very, very similar results, and that's reassuring.
Great. Oh yeah, that is also, I think, very similar to how governments do it, right? They collect GDP data on both expenditure and income side, and if they're not very close, then they need to do some better work because then there's a problem. But they're very close.
Yeah, I gained a lot of appreciation for what offices of statistics in governments need to do, because they also use a variety of data sources and to compute GDP, and often there's revisions that go a couple quarters and months later. Having now tried to do this with my own survey data, which in many ways is better than what the data they have, but in some ways is also worse. It gives me a lot of appreciation for what they do.
Very interesting, yeah. And so then, and what's then the evidence that you found, sort of like, if we talk about it from this sort of survey kind of way, to that indeed these theories are correct, that there is this multiplier and that there is. Can you go a little bit into that? Like how did you actually measure that or test that or yeah?
Yeah, so basically now you have this data, right? You can compute GDP with all of this underlying data. For every village or for every person, you can compute their total income, and then it's a question of summing up, right? So what was the direct effect on treated, which you can get from comparing treated and control people? What's the additional spillover effect? So the additional effect that other people got who maybe did not get the money, but just from being exposed to neighbors getting money. There you compare people who are sort of in these high intensity regions where a lot of their neighbors got money to those that are in the low intensity where few neighbors got money. And again, those people are exactly the same because it was randomized whether a lot of money went to their neighbors or not. You get an effect on income or an expenditure for these by comparing those two groups. And then you sum it all up. You basically say, well, here's the direct effect plus the spillover effect over the last 2 years. What's the total increase in income over the last 2 years? And you compare that to how much money was transferred overall, and that ratio is 2.5. And whether you do it with expenditure or income. So that's basically the methodology. And I think for those who are sort of statistically minded and savvy, they can look at the regression equations in the paper and the sort of empirical strategy. There's sort of statistical tools to do that. But basically it's about comparing high and low intensity and treated and control, and then summing up all these effects.
Did you also compare to regions that were totally untreated?
Yeah, so, this is sort of important, right? Because as you rightly say, when you have spillovers, even the people who did not get money sort of are always treated to some degree. And so just comparing treatment to control will underestimate the treatment effect because your control also increased spending. And so the difference is smaller than the actual total effect compared to what would have happened had nobody gotten money. And so basically, this is what the second level of randomization is for. What this creates is a lot of variation across space, across these different villages in the share of neighbors treated. So for example, in the lowest, in some regions, there's almost nobody treated within 4 kilometers. But in some regions, there's almost everybody treated within 4 kilometers. And so now instead of just comparing treatment versus control, what we actually do is sort of compare different bins or a linear we try to get a linear relationship. And what you see is actually that this thing increases linearly. So total income in a village increases linearly with the share of neighbors that are treated, right? And so we have very low treated villages, which are almost pure control. And then we can also show you that there's a linear increase in income in the fraction of neighbors that is treated. And so we feel pretty confident that, we have a good extrapolation or a good sense of a pure control in our setting. And you wouldn't have that if you didn't have this second level of randomization where you had very low intensity and high intensity regions.
Yeah. Okay. That's very interesting. Yeah, that makes sense. And just before we sort of get back to your results, I think we discussed mostly now sort of the experimental setup. Just for sort of reference, can you remind me again, what was the total number of dollars dropped on this region? And how many people were actually affected by all of this? What are we talking about again in size of scale?
Okay, so the scale of the whole thing. Yeah, so I think we talked about every household got $1,000, about 1 year of income. Every village, only people with a thatched roof, with an organic roof, got the money. So those were the eligible people. It's about 1/3 of each village.
Why is that?
Because basically they wanted to target the poorest people. And it's very difficult to target the poorest people because if you go to people and ask them, what's your income? They might think that, oh, they're going to give me something if I tell them my income's very low. So that's a tricky thing. And so what people usually do is these proxy means tests, things that are very predictive of poverty, but that are harder to gain. And so having an organic material roof is a pretty good marker.
But now I'm confused. Then couldn't you say that it is a conditional cash transfer because it's conditioned on you being very poor, measured by this roof measurement?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Well, typically when we say conditional cash transfers, we mean like you get money if you send your kids to school.
Yeah. Okay.
It's like it's conditional on some behavior. Here it's targeted. Yes, it's not untargeted.
Right.
But it's unconditional.
Okay. Yeah. Unconditional with regards to how to spend it. Yeah.
Exactly. Okay. But incidentally, Give Directly, for example, our partner organization now has shifted to a universal model. So they're also doing a big universal basic income trial in another part of Kenya now for 12 years. I work with them in Malawi now where they treat literally everybody, every adult, untargeted. And we'll see if that's different at all. But anyway, so that's how they did it. And then there's 600 villages in the study. Half of them are treated. So 300 villages are treated. And in total, that's sort of something like $12 million to 12,000 recipients in that study.
Yeah. Okay. 12,000 households, right? Is then the unit
households.
Of
households.
So that can be like two people or 4 or 5, depending on sort of their family situation.
4.5 on average. Exactly, 4.5 on average. And so overall, it's about 15% of GDP. So 15% of local area income in treated regions was sort of injected in terms of cash. And that's very big. That's much bigger than all the tax rebates or the inflation reduction plans or the COVID stimulus checks. It's bigger than all of those. As a fraction of the economy. Of course, this is a small economy in a poor place, so the dollar amount doesn't sound that much, but it's really a lot for these households and these economies.
And then sort of bring it back to your main findings. You found that the GDP of these regions increased more by roughly 2.5 times more than the money injected. That actually the effects took quite a long time. That is like over 2.5 years, if I remember correctly. And there was no or almost no inflation as a result of this. It really all went into real GDP, is what we would say, like not nominal GDP. Am I leaving something out?
No, I think that's it. And what does it mean? Demand is an important thing, and cash has much wider benefits than just the ones to recipients. I want to just tease a little bit the ongoing pipeline of research of what we're now doing, right? So one thing I've already sort of mentioned, right, is this is up to 2.5 years. We went back again 5 and 7 years later. Now we're currently in the field doing more surveys 10 years later. So this has been ongoing for a long time. And the idea there is, well, if benefits continue to exist, maybe because, in the long term, people send their kids to school, get bigger businesses, maybe there's immigration, maybe there's some market structure changes. If these effects persist, then the multiplier could be even bigger, right? Then for $1 over 10 years, maybe you've created $8. I don't want to preview the results. Maybe they go away. Maybe it isn't 8. We'll see. But that's sort of what we're trying to do there, and is there longer term changes. The other thing that's really important for us is intergenerational changes. So how does this affect not just the household, but the kids growing up in these households? So one paper that should come out very soon is on child mortality. So we went back and collected a census of all the births over the last 10 years in all of these 70,000 households in the study region. And we sort of tracked their birth outcomes. And what we find is that households who got money sort of in utero or in the first sort of two years after their child was born have a very substantial reduction in child mortality. So their children survive longer, they're healthier, and that's just another added benefit. And we hope to be following up with the children as well over time to see, do they go to school longer? Do they accumulate more human capital? Do they then have higher earnings later on in life? And if that's true, I mean, then we're really talking about big returns to these types of investments, because that changes the whole trajectory of a child's life for 60, 80 years. And that would obviously be wonderful, but we don't know yet. So far, we know that child mortality went down, which is already incredible, and it went down by quite a bit. What we don't know yet is about the trajectory of these children over time.
So this is again like more evidence that these direct cash transfers are just one of the most efficient ways of doing development aid. That it really helps, right? That it doesn't go away all of a sudden. But that's a complementary approach to sort of the more supply side sort of things, right? Like, I think this is a point you made earlier. Like, this helped increase demand, thereby increasing supply. But it's not as if then it's all of a sudden useless to build schools or something. It's just a different approach. And in this case, what I really like about it is that you're helping also humanity's understanding of economics, because, really for one of the first times ever, we can have evidence for some of these theories that we've been debating over for decades.
Yeah, exactly. And we hope to create more with other types of at-scale programs and, chip away at this big question. It's not an easy one, right? Otherwise, we would have solved development if it was easy. But we're trying to build the evidence base and see what works and what works best. Certainly, I think what's happened now, because of all of these studies of cash, is that cash is increasingly used as a benchmark. So, I'm proposing to have this education program. Well, can you show that the impacts of that are bigger than if you had just given the money to people unconditionally? Including all the costs. So you do like rigorous cost effectiveness measures, comparing things to cash. And our study and other studies are sort of go into that comparison. And I think that's a good direction to go, because, with limited resources, with limited money, you want to spend it as effectively or as efficiently as you can to make lives better for the most people.
Are you also, or colleagues, sort of researching this type of research in developed economies? Because I would be really interested to find that, okay, this is core also to your message, right? Like, you found, like, here's this almost no inflation with a cash injection, but I would love to be able to see at some point sort of where that threshold would be, like, or how you can find out if there is enough slack. Like, now we are getting a little bit of inflation, a little bit more in these conditions, right?
Yeah. And so there's some ongoing work that I do with others in give directly scaled up and other types of government programs in Ethiopia, scaling up these types of programs. So one in Malawi, for example, they're now treating everybody as universal. And so this is about 125% of GDP, because Malawi is also a little bit poor. And so, that's like an almost 10 times larger shock, and we're going to see if it starts to kick in there, if we see inflation there. I don't have results yet. People have also started doing experiments like that on universal basic income in the US, for example. In Finland, there's a trial in Barcelona. Those are mostly about the direct effects. And the reason basically is that they're not big enough to do these. And that's also because, if you wanted to randomly assign, 15% of GDP to random commuting zones in the US, you're talking about big money.
Billions,
that's very, very hard to do. Exactly. And so basically the micro studies are super interesting and are just coming out. And there's a large group of people working on, especially the US ones. There's like 12 different studies looking at all kinds of aspects, just like labor supply and health and taxes and job choices and life satisfaction in the US. And so stay tuned for that. I think some of the working papers are already out there, and they find interesting results. For example, on labor supply, that's the one I know best, is what I said before. There you actually see some reductions in people's work time, especially if they have kids. And then, some people interpret this as being disappointed. Oh, it doesn't work.
Yeah, that was these were the headlines, I think, right? Like when this came out.
But like, what does it mean to work? And again, I would be the non-paternalistic person, or try to interpret this that way. If that's the most efficient way for them to spend the money, is to spend more time with their kids, that's great. By revealed preference, as we would call it in economics, that's good. That's good for people. Just because they stop working in jobs that they don't like and spend more money with their kids, I think that's a great outcome. Almost by definition, that's the best thing they could have done with the money, because they know best what the best thing is, right? And so I wouldn't call this disappointing just because you have a different expectation.
Isn't there also a little bit of bias there? And I'm also talking as a young parent myself, that sort of we don't count parenting as a job, but it is very much a job, and it's contributing to the future of the economy as well, right? Like they're not working, but they're still working towards investing in their kids.
Absolutely, and like as I said, it's more sort of a philosophical point. It's like, almost by definition, whatever people want to do with that money is the best thing for them. Like, who am I to say no? They should have really continued working. That's really what we want. Maybe if all you care about is economic growth or like the local spending, that's what you want. But I care about what people want, and so I leave it up to them. So that's what they do. That's what they do in these small experiments. For larger experiments, they use what we would call sort of quasi-experimental methods. So you can't really do a big experiment in the US because it would cost a lot, even though I think it would be interesting. So people use things like increases in military spending because of unexpected wars that then differentially hit different states or different places, to see what then happens to the economies in these places when things like that happen. And then that's how they estimate multipliers in these types of settings. And they do find some multipliers too. As I said, I think my reading of the evidence is that typically this fact that multipliers, when you use these methods, are bigger in developing countries for the few studies that we have than in developed countries. I think that's true. But I'm in no way an expert.
And it does make sense with your theory, at least, that there is more slack in developing countries, partially because they have these super small firms. Yeah.
That's our preferred explanation, yeah.
Hey, and so if people want to support your research and also make the life of very poor people way, way better, is the best way to do it then just to give directly? So
Yeah, no, people have different preferences over what they would like to give. Our research certainly suggests cash is an effective way to do it, and give directly is one way that you can give cash. And I think it's fairly easy to donate to them, and I really like their organization, unsurprisingly, given some of the findings that we have. So yeah, look at it if you're interested.
Yeah, I'll actually put a link in the description of this video for people to donate, and then there's just my bias being a super economics nerd, that I also find it an extreme bonus then that you're also supporting revolutionary economic research, such as that you're doing, because without that cash you could never do this experiment, right?
Yeah, exactly. This is always true. I work not just with Gift directly. I work with the Ethiopian government. I work with other types of government implementation partners. You always need this sort of fruitful collaboration with an implementation partner, somebody who's willing to learn, who thinks science is important, because it's not easy to do, right? You have to make sure you adhere to the randomization. You have to give people a couple of months to collect baseline data. You have to stay engaged and put resources into this process, and I'm super grateful. And of course, there's something going the other way, right? Hopefully, the learnings can now improve future programs and future ways of doing things for these partners, like the governments or like the NGOs. And so, these collaborations are key, and I love that increasingly governments and NGOs believe in science and rigorous evaluation and doing these kind of things and learning together, and hopefully making everything better in the process.
Thank you so much, Dennis, for talking to us about the revolutionary work that you're doing. I thought it was super insightful. To actually get some evidence-based examples of what multipliers are, what supply and aggregate supply and demand, sort of how they can interact to not produce inflation or produce inflation. And yeah, thank you so much for this. I think this was an economics lesson in itself, and I'm sure I will be following all of your future work closely.
Thank you so much, Joeri. Had a great time chatting to you, and yeah, appreciate the invite.